Greetings from the Iranian Studies Unit of the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. My name is Mehran Kamrava. I'm a professor of government at Georgetown University and with the Iranian Studies Unit here at the Arab Center. Our panel today examines the sectarian aspects of Iranian foreign policy. And today I am joined by an outstanding group of experts that will help us navigate this important and interesting topic. Allow me to introduce each of our panelists, starting with Shahram Akbarzadeh, who is joining us from Australia. Shahram Akbarzadeh is professor of Middle East and Central Asian politics and convener of Middle East Studies Forum at Alfred Deakin Institute at the Deakin University in Australia. His latest publications include the Routledge Handbook of International Relations in the Middle East, which was published in 2020, and Presidential Elections in Iran, published in 2021 by Cambridge University Press, along with Muhammad Pargu. Joining us also is Fanar Haddad, another good friend with whom I've had the pleasure for a long time now of collaborating. Fanar is assistant professor at the Department of Cross-Cultural and Regional Studies at the University of Copenhagen. Prior to joining the University of Copenhagen, Professor Haddad was senior advisor on international affairs to the Prime Minister of Iraq. He previously taught the politics of the modern Middle East at the University of Exeter, at Queen Mary University of London, and at the National University of Singapore. Fanar Haddad is widely published on issues relating to historic and contemporary Iraq and on identity politics in the region. He is the author of Sectarianism in Iraq, Antagonistic Visions of Unity, and Understanding Sectarianism, Sunni-Shia Relations in the Modern Arab World, which came out in 2020. Last but by no means least is Edward Wastnidge, who is senior lecturer in politics and international studies at Open University in UK. Professor Wastnidge's research concerns the politics of international relations of the Middle East and foreign policy, the interactions of ideas and foreign policy, and cultural and religious diplomacy. He is an expert on Iranian foreign policy as well, and serves as the Deputy Director of Sectarianism, Proxies, and Desectarianization Project at Lancaster University. Wastnidge is co-editor of Identities and Geopolitics in the Middle East book series with Manchester University Press. He is the author of Diplomacy and Reform in Iran, Foreign Policy under Khatami, and co-editor, along with the distinguished Simon Mabon, of Saudi Arabia and Iran, The Struggle to Shape the Middle East. He has authored numerous peer-reviewed articles, book chapters, and policy briefs. My sincere thanks to all three of you, Shahram, Fanar, and Edward, for joining us today. Before we get started, I would just like to remind the audience that they can submit their questions via the Q&A feature on Zoom or by commenting on the live stream posts of the events of the Arab Center's social media platforms. You can also change the language with the interpretation function of Zoom. Each of our distinguished panelists has agreed to make some brief introductory remarks of about 10 minutes, and then they have also kindly agreed to take some questions. We'll go to a Q&A shortly after. So why don't we start with you, Shahram? Take it away, please.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Kamrava, for the invitation. I'm delighted to be a part of this discussion. I have about 10 minutes to cover a whole lot. So I think that's probably the challenge we all face. So looking at sectarianism in Iranian foreign policy. And the very first thing I want to perhaps start with by saying is that Iranian foreign policy is very much caught in a security dilemma. And that really defines all its actions. Initially, the Iranian foreign policy has applied an ideological lens to view the world. And that's very much a reflection of Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei's, the founder of the Islamic Republic. Ayatollah Khamenei's view and experience of exile in Iraq, and his view of how Iran was isolated and was, again, in a way, standing up to the West and championing the desire and the grievances of the Muslim world. In his view, Iran was versing the whole world. That experience, that perspective was very much solidified during the Iran-Iraq war. It was solidified by the fact that many regional powers in the Middle East, the United States, sided with Iraq, and it reinforced that view that Iran was indeed facing the might of the United States and its allies in the region, including Israel, of course. So it's not surprising to see how the United States and others responded to Iranian perspective and Iranian rhetoric about the relationship between Iran and the world. They retaliated. They put Iran under sanctions, and the US policy is well documented, and it was very much about containing Iran. Leading to a mutually reinforcing situation of suspicions and fears between Iran and the United States. And that's been going on, that's been defining US-Iran relations for the past 40-odd years. We had perhaps a window of opportunity following September 11. It was a circuit breaker where it was possible, there was possibility and there were hopes that that kind of relationship would change. But the fact that President George W. Bush carried on with his war on terror and the idea of regime change in Afghanistan and in Iraq, that window of opportunity closed very quickly. And again, it reinforced the message that, that Iran was alone and that Iran could not rely on other states or the goodwill of the United States. It also highlights the significance of personalities in foreign policy making, but I don't want to go down that path. Perhaps we can come back to it during question time. So Iran is obviously very aware that it has very limited resources. Iran is very much aware that it cannot withstand the might of the United States in a traditional, conventional warfare, and as a result has opted for asymmetrical capacity building. And that means that Iran is looking for ways of gaining an edge over traditional ways of warfare. The idea of forward defense, the forward defense doctrine, is a manifestation of that thinking. And that is to address threats before they materialize on the national frontier and to deter attacks, making attacks more costly for anyone who dares to actually engage with Iran militarily. And there have been many declarations by the Supreme Leader that they would use Hezbollah on US interests if the US even imagined or dreamt of attacking Iran. So it's a way of deterring attacks. Now, the most obvious, I mentioned Hezbollah as the most obvious ally of Iran, but Iran hasn't been very successful in finding allies in the region. Iran has been able to build relationship with a number of sub-state actors often minority groups, driving from minority groups or communities that have been suppressed. Hamas obviously stands out. A number of Iraqi militia organizations have been part of the Iranian effort to build a network of allies and proxies. And that was only possible after the United States deposed Saddam Hussein. Houthis is another example, but it's debatable how much influence and links actually exist between Iran and the Houthis. And of course, the Afghan and Pakistani militias that were organized under the banner of Fatimiyun and Zainabiyun Brigade operating in Syria. So what we see, the common factor among these proxy actors is that they're all Shia. They all have a Shia affiliation, with the exception of Hamas. And in fact, Hamas broke ties with Iran following the Arab Spring, and it was just impossible to maintain that relationship. And this creates a problem for Iran. Iran did not set out to be a sectarian power. Iran set out to be the champion of the Ummah, the champion of Mustazafin, or the oppressed. That's in the Iranian constitution, and that's very much a factor in the thinking of Iranian leadership. The problem is the nature of regional politics in the Middle East, the nature of how states have marginalized, in a way, their Shia population, especially in Saudi Arabia, that has created a ready audience for the Iranian message, so that Iran is can easily access the Shia community and Shia population a lot easier than other communities. So if you think about, I'm trying to wrap up here very quickly. So if you think about this, Iranian foreign policy is a very realist response to external threats. And the problem is that the threats are to a large extent a product of Iran's own antagonism towards the United States and its allies in the region. And this has created a self-perpetuating cycle of suspicion and fear. And that's without a circuit breaker, like the opportunity we had during September 11, or following September 11, I should say, it is difficult to see how Iran can break out of that cycle. Iran, I don't think it is possible to claim that Iran set out to be a sectarian power, but the dynamics, the broader dynamics of the region has put Iran in a corner where it can only reach out to sectarian communities, Shia communities, I should say. Thank you.
My sincere thanks, Shahram. Only you, I think, can manage to present such a concise, give us such a concise presentation on a complex phenomenon as you did. Sincere thanks. Fanar, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mehran. Good morning to everyone who's signed up. Firstly, let me thank you, Mehran. By the way, wonderful to see you after quite some time. So thank you to you and to the Arab Center for organizing this event and for inviting me to contribute. So let me start with this. As ever, when the word sectarianism is used, it can quickly become unclear what it is we're talking about. So with regards to today's subject, there's a lot of commentary out there that reduces the term sectarianism to little more than shorthand for the geopolitical rivalry between some Arab states and Iran, or it reduces the term to the projection of Iranian power abroad. But to me, this never quite made sense. I mean, why would power politics or power projection be referred to as sectarianism just because Iran is involved? So alternatively, there's a more nuanced approach that looks at the methods and the aims of Iranian policy and labels that sectarianism. But even here, it's not entirely clear what is meant. In discussing sectarianism and Iranian foreign policy, are we inquiring into whether or not Iranian policy is anti-Sunni? Because I'm not sure it is. Or, by sectarianism and Iranian foreign policy, are we asking if Iranian foreign policy aims at fostering Sunni-Shia division? Well, at certain times, in certain places, I do think that sectarian polarization has worked to Iran's advantage. And much the same can be said for a number of other actors in the region and beyond. Alternatively, when talking about sectarianism and Iranian foreign policy, do we mean employing and strengthening transnational Shia solidarity for strategic ends and using the language of sectarian conflict to build transnational Shia networks? Now, here I think we're on much more solid ground, and there's no shortage of examples illustrating Iran's use of Shia narratives and Shia networks for strategic gain. And I think one of the most unambiguous examples of that is the defense of the shrines narrative that was employed in Syria and the mobilization of Shia militias from as far afield as Afghanistan and Pakistan, as Dr. Shahram said, to fight in Syria, very much in the name of a Shia self-defense, so to speak. Now, a harder question to answer is, what normative conclusions can we draw from this about Iranian foreign policy writ large? Ultimately, Iran, I think, as was very clear in Dr. Shahram's presentation, ultimately, Iran, like other actors, pursues its interests. And in doing so, it has a foreign policy toolbox filled with conventional and non-conventional tools. The sectarian card is one such tool. The question is, how and when is this tool used? Now, on the one hand, the sectarian card obviously is not exclusive to the Iranian toolkit. But on the other hand, I do think that the sectarian card's efficacy and potential for Iran differs from that of other cases. And this is primarily because of the nature of the current Iranian state. The fact that it is a self-proclaimed Islamic state claiming to represent pan-Shi'ism and a Shia-led pan-Islamism has several implications for our discussion. Firstly, the appeal to sectarian solidarity is a perhaps more salient tool for Iran than for other actors because of how it projects itself as a patron of transnational Shi'ism. Secondly, the nature of the regime also means that it becomes easier, though not always accurate, for Iranian foreign policy to be viewed or represented through the prism of sectarian identity. For example, the way that the alliance between Tehran and Damascus is sometimes viewed as a function of sectarian solidarity rather than shared strategic interest and shared threat perception. And this raises a question that I think Dr. Shahram kind of touched on. How much of the sectarianism that is associated with Iranian policy is sectarianism by design, and how much of it is sectarianism by default? Thirdly, Iran has a special position in international Shi'ism, one that doesn't really have a Sunni equivalent. Iran aspires to be the sponsor of international Shi'ism, and as such, exerts a gravitational pull on Shia movements worldwide. Now, of course, not all Shia actors are equally proximate or equally on terms with Iran, but Iran's position as a would-be sponsor of international Shi'ism has several implications. Firstly, it presents non-Iranian Shia-centric actors with a potential foreign Shi'i sponsor. Secondly, it gives Iran a potential avenue through which to advance its strategic interests abroad. And thirdly, and as a result, it ends up blurring the line between sectarian identity and geopolitics, in turn potentially complicating sectarian relations both regionally and within individual countries. And I think that this can happen regardless of whether or not Iran intends it to be so. It's a function of Iran's unique place in international Shi'ism and the attendant geopolitical implications of that. But here there's a paradox. There's something paradoxical about the sectarian card and Iran. So on the one hand, the sectarian card is very effective in Iran's hands for the reasons I mentioned. But on the other hand, it's much costlier for Iran to play the sectarian card than it is for other actors. And I think this is a function of practical reasons relating to demographics. Even the most generous estimates of global Shi'ism would place it at well below 20% of global Islam. And if we zoom into the Arab world, that figure drops significantly. So by my calculation, in the 22 countries that constitute the Arab League, the Shia population comes to between 9 and 11%, depending on how you define Shia, right? And if you dissect that number further, you'll find that Shiism in the Arab world is heavily concentrated in a few places, most notably in Iraq. It's often overlooked that at least half of all Arab Shias are Iraqi. So this demographic weakness of Shiism, combined with Iran's pan-Islamic pretensions, mean that sectarian entrenchment is not always in Iran's interest, which is precisely why, as is widely noted, Iran has traditionally sought to downplay its Shia identity on the international stage, while its rivals have sought to overplay it. But whatever its preferred ideal, there's no denying that Shia identity, transnational Shia linkages have been a very effective way with which Iran has built influence and projected power. Now, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, elsewhere, Iran has backed Shia groups. It's also backed non-Shia groups. Even within the Shia groups, it has backed Iran loyalist groups and not so Iran loyalist groups. But it is, practically speaking, it is the Shia and specifically the Iran loyalist Shia groups that are the backbone of its regional strategy. Now, is this the result of a sectarian calculation, or is it the practical reality that like-minded loyalists are a safer and more effective bet than other proxies? For me, it makes sense that Iranian security actors will work better and more effectively with those who share their worldview. So Iran loyalist Shias are a more effective tool. Iran may have other kinds of proxies, but these are the core, which partly, I think, explains why Iran tries to use its soft power strategies to expand this demographic through its cultural activities, through reconstruction and social service provision, through proselytization in places like Syria and elsewhere. Let me wrap up. I'll end with just a brief word on Iraq. And this again touches on how the sectarian card is not always so straightforward. So in Iraq, Iran has the foothold, it has the demographics, it has the tools and the proxies to play sectarian politics. And today's backing of the Shia house in Iraq and the insistence on Shia solidarity, or at least Shia consensus, ahead of the formation of the next Iraqi government can be considered an example of that. But these policies can backfire, and I think that they have in recent years in Iraq in the form of a pronounced, and I would say growing, anti-Iranian sentiment in Iraq. And this is something that is being voiced more loudly today than ever by the very constituency that is supposed to be, or one would assume is, Iran's target audience, namely young Shias. Likewise, for all its influence, Iran is clearly no longer able to manage Iraqi Shia fragmentation at the elite level. The fragmentation of Shia politics in Iraq is something that Iran is no longer able to control the way it used to. I presume Iran has been trying to recalculate its strategy in Iraq. And in doing so, frankly, I don't see how sectarianism, however you choose to define it, will serve their ends in the current climate. As is clearly demonstrated today, be it at the elite or at the popular level, calls for Shia solidarity have a much reduced resonance today than was the case when Iraq was in the chaos of a sect-coded civil war. Likewise, Iran's network of armed proxies in Iraq are ultimately a rather blunt instrument that are much more useful in times of confrontation than in these times of relative calm. And again, here we find a significant backlash against these actors, and we're seeing the limits of their effectiveness. In short, Iraq has been going through some profound changes in recent years, and it's an open question whether Iranian policy has been adequately keeping up with these changes. Thank you.
Absolutely brilliant, Fanar. Thank you so very much. Excellent. Really great. Edward.
Great, thank you very much, and thanks again for the invite, Mehran. And it's a real pleasure to be on this panel with a group of scholars whose work I admire a lot and have consulted often over the years. So it's a real honour. So today I've been asked to briefly talk about Iran-Saudi relations in the context of sectarianism. And I'll start us off briefly by alluding to the broad sweep of literature and commentary on this relationship or rivalry as it's often presented. And I'll then quickly run through what some of the view from Tehran is on this relationship, and look briefly at the extent to which this rivalry plays out in some other ways in Iranian foreign policy as well, looking at some other cases beyond the region. And then finally offer some thoughts as to whether I think sectarianism is the best prism with which to analyze Iran-Saudi relations. And spoiler alert, there's a lot more to it than just that. So, as I think many of people here today are all aware, although it's by no means the sole factor in shaping regional politics, the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran has played an increasingly influential role in the last few decades, prompting the publication of a growing body of literature on the topic. And as, of course, many of you will know, my dear friend and colleague, Professor Simon Mabon, has been one of the leading voices in covering this often troubled relationship, and we have contributions from many people watching today as well, and on the panel too on this. And thank you for the plug of our edited volume coming out later this year, earlier as well, Mehran. That's coming out shortly. So these efforts to understand this rivalry between Riyadh and Tehran have produced a body of literature, I think, that can be broadly separated into three camps. The first suggests, broadly following classical sort of realist lines, that the rivalry is best understood through a balance of power in the Persian Gulf. And here we can point to the works of Greg Gores, Shahram Chubin, Charles Tripp, Robert Mason, Henna Fertig, and others. There's a second camp that suggests that religion plays a very prominent role in shaping the nature of the rivalry, and that these so-called proxy conflicts between the two have been subsequently drawn along sectarian lines. And here we have accounts, I think, that at times can sail rather close to primordialist interpretations of the rivalry and indeed wider regional politics, and reducing things to this kind of ancient hatreds type thesis. And we see elements of this in the work of Vali Nasr and others, which draw upon those kind of Shia revival, Shia crescent ideas that found quite a lot of traction, I think, in policy circles a few years ago, especially in the US, although less prominent now. And there are other accounts, of course, that try and tie this a little more closely with international relations between the two powers, the work of Larry Rubin and others. And there's a third camp, and I guess it's one that I think those here today, if I may be so bold to suggest it, would fit into. And that suggests that a more nuanced approach is needed that draws upon concerns about regime power and legitimacy, both externally and internally, looks at work on securitization and with a kind of instrumentalization of religious difference, which is dependent on context and contingent upon time and space. And that corresponds to a lot of work, I think, that's gone on recently with colleagues who are involved in SEPAD and others. But for better or worse, sectarianism, and with it notions of sectarianization, still carries a lot of weight, I think, in a lot of policy-oriented explanations of the rivalry. And the main venue for this is often cited as these, so-called proxy conflicts within the region. Now, as has been touched upon, both Iran and Saudi Arabia have certainly made use of sectarian affiliation to advance their aims in various theatres. Obviously, that's not always been the case, and certainly it may well be true again in the future, especially if the current rapprochement between Tehran and Riyadh gains further momentum. But if we look back into history in the late 90s, early 2000s, during the Khatami period, ties were good and there was a positive détente. Obviously, things changed with the Arab uprisings and in societies that were divided along sect-based lines at that point, most notably the examples we mentioned earlier. These schisms provided opportunities for both sides to operate in pursuit of an improved regional standing, often at the expense of the other. So what's the view from Tehran on this rivalry? And I think that's something that is quite often overlooked, especially if we look in terms of the public policy debate within Iran, which is often quite lively and critical too. And I think that although a kind of sectarian entrepreneurship, if we want to call it that, has been a feature of the relationship and has been transposed onto certain states and conflicts, Tehran's main concerns are more geopolitical. And now that's not to dismiss the role of various identities or ideational currents, be they religious, national, or indeed revolutionary narratives. But I think it's actually pragmatism that dominates any notion of sectarianism in foreign policy making in Iran. And as a result, the question of Iran's relations with Saudi Arabia, I think in this case, are intimately tied to both states' relations with the United States. I mean, you could argue that actually the conditions are potentially quite ripe for rapprochement at the moment, given the downturn in US-Saudi ties, perhaps. But when it comes specifically to religion or narratives around religion, Tehran has long promoted the notion that Saudi Wahhabism is a threat, and that has been overlaid onto its justifications for the action it's taken in the wider Middle Eastern region. Now, the Iranian government's narrative on this has been that Saudi Arabia has historically promoted a sectarian agenda in the region for many years, and that Iran is merely defending its co-religionists and indeed other oppressed groups from this threat. This broadly religious sphere has been a site of contention, particularly when certain, let's say, religiously informed or embedded identity narratives are deployed. So you could say that there is potentially a sort of geopoliticization of identity that's taken place within the rivalry, and that is often something that is expressed through an instrumentalization of religion to provide, I guess, additional depth and justification for certain policy stances or to certain constituencies. So Tehran utilizes well-established, sometimes religiously grounded themes of fighting oppression and standing up to the Saudi-led extremist or Takfiri threat. And I think the same goes for how something like the axis of resistance is conceptualized by Tehran. That's now developed beyond its original focus on opposing Israel to become something of a regional security community network. I mean, very much in a non-traditional sense, but it's now focused on countering what Tehran sees as Saudi and other states sponsoring of extremism. So that's part of Tehran's own war on terror, as the narrative goes. And that narrative that's expounded by Tehran is deployed, I think, to provide a deterrent against perceived Saudi hegemonic desires. But it's also lamented by some commentators within Iran who seek to emphasize that a less, perhaps ideologically driven stance towards Saudi Arabia would be more beneficial. As we discussed earlier, I mean, Tehran has backed Islamic groups, regardless of sect, that have emerged across the Middle East since the Arab uprisings and before. And in these efforts, Iran's policies are, yes, driven by ideological undertones, but ultimately they seek to expand security for the Iranian state by preventing governments that surround it from forming a unified front against the Islamic Republic. So yes, you know, Iran does like to frame its intentions through adopting religious rhetoric at times, but it's usually one that insists on protecting the oppressed masses regardless of sect and to build a utopian Muslim ummah. And we see this in its frequent attempts actually to host, you know, Islamic unity events. There's a unity week every year in Tehran. It funds organizations devoted to promoting dialogue between different sects. And of course, Iran regularly supports the Palestinian cause and cites this as an exemplar of Islamic unity that should transcend any sect-based difference. So I think there's some interesting kind of quite top-down processes of something we might even determine as efforts at desectarianization that are actively happening from the Iranian state, at least. And then finally, there are many ways, of course, in which this rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia has very little to do with sectarianism. And if we take the example of Central Asia, I mean, while Saudi Arabia has perhaps historically made use of some confessional linkages there, Iran's foreign policy towards the region has not really had any sectarian character whatsoever. We take the case of Tajikistan. It's an interesting example that shows how geopolitical opportunism can be a feature of this rivalry as well. So very quickly, Iran has always pursued good relations with Dushanbe, drawing on those kind of common Persian language bonds it has with Tajikistan. However, when there was a rupture in Iran's ties with that country back in 2016, and that was on account of them hosting a Tajik opposition leader there, actually, ironically, at one of these Islamic unity events that it was hosting, the Saudis swept in and sought to capitalize on that rupture in ties by offering financing for various projects, so kind of filling that gap. And then very quickly, if we take the case of the US, of course, you know, the sense of malign intent on the part of the US is channeled through policies that in Tehran's eyes aim to divide Muslims, wreak havoc on its ability to have mutually beneficial relations with the kingdom specifically. But there are, you know, numerous critics of Tehran's stance vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia, particularly in terms of its lack of interest or sufficient diplomatic nous when dealing with Riyadh, and other people in the public policy debate within Iran frame relations in terms of the damaging effect that the US-Saudi relationship has on Riyadh's own ability to act independently. And so many of these discourses feed into a general picture of viewing Saudi Arabia as an unequal partner in the region. So to very quickly wrap up, I think while there's been a certain level of instrumentalization of co-sectarian groups, and of course, people can point to the fifth column arguments that have been well worn. It has by no means been the driving force or even key determining factor behind this complex relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia. I think any support for certain groups is part of, as our previous speakers have said, part of those forward defense, it's regime survival. It's not driven by sectarian affiliation in and of itself, but it serves as a useful tool. And ultimately, Iran wants to protect its national security at all costs. And if we're going to see any form of sectarianizing discourse, I think it's generally limited to those kind of extremist groups, ISIS, Al Qaeda, that Iran views as an existential threat. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Fantastic, Edward. My sincere thanks. My thanks to all three of you for such brilliant and concise explanations, and also for sticking to time. My deep gratitude. We have a couple of questions that have come to us from social media, but before we go to them, I wanted to ask Shahram, we're approaching the first-year anniversary of the election of a new administration in Iran, one that, at least from the outside, there's been an assumption that this administration will be more conservative and therefore more ideological. And all three of you have alluded to the Khatami presidency. The question I have is, to what extent are there consistencies in Iranian foreign policy in terms of its at least ideological representation and ideological manifestations, as opposed to continuities from one administration to another, from Ahmadinejad to Rouhani and now Raisi administrations?
That's a very good question, Mehran. I think as Edward and Fanar have both alluded to, Iranian foreign policy, Iranian politics is very pragmatic. Despite all the rhetoric that we hear coming out of Iran, decisions are made on the basis of what could benefit Iranian interests. And Iranian interest is, of course, defined as interest of the regime. So regime survival is the key here. What could assist regime survival, regime prosperity? It is a very existential kind of perspective on foreign policy making. Let's not forget that the reason that the nuclear deal was allowed to commence was a realization that Iranian economy was on the verge of collapse, and that as a result, Iranian regime was on the verge of collapse. It could not maintain the way it had for so many years. So the current president, I think my assessment is that he is going to continue that pragmatic approach. He was very critical of the nuclear deal when he was in opposition, but once he's been in office, he's actually been happy to send the delegation back to Vienna and resume talks. They haven't succeeded because things outside their control have really derailed the nuclear talks, namely Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I think that the point on continuity is quite pronounced between these various presidents and different administrations, and that's a question of pragmatic decision making based on how they see the future and the survival of the regime.
Perfect, thank you. Fanar, I've always been intrigued by the somewhat unique arrangement in which Khamenei's marja'iyat, position of his position as being a source of emulation in Shia Islam, applies only to outside Iran. So he is considered a marja' not for Shia in Iran, but for those outside of Iran. Do you know if at all, or to what extent, Khamenei's marja'iyat is accepted in Iraq or in Bahrain or elsewhere?
That's a good question and not an easy one to answer. But I mean, my impression is that particularly in the case of Iraq, there is a constituency that would accept or follow his marji'iyya, but this is more out of political ideology rather than religious inclination, right? So those who are subscribe to the axis of resistance and the like would view Khamenei as a political and a religious source of emulation, if you like. My impression is that that constituency is not a particularly large one, particularly if we move down away from the elite political level. I think on a social level, particularly in Iraq, given the presence of Najaf, given the presence of Sistani and the other Maraji', I think that the competition for Shia hearts and minds is a stiff one in Iraq. And I think the Qawm Marji'iyya would struggle to really create a social base, a significant social base in Iraq that can compete with Najaf and Sistani. But I will repeat that there is a constituency, it does exist. I think its influence is disproportional to its size, given its political empowerment and the like. I'll say one thing just from a general observation in other places, one does come across people who emulate Khamenei, and almost always it does seem to be linked to this political stance as much, if not more so, as it is a religious stance.
Yes. And as you mentioned, far more accomplished theologians and scholars are based both in Iran and in Iraq that outrank Khamenei. And on the whole, one can argue that Najaf is now home to much more prominent scholars of Shiism as compared to Qom, that has become in many ways politicized since the Iranian Revolution. So, absolutely. Edward, you very aptly mentioned Iran's tensions, for example, with Tajikistan. We could also add, for example, the tensions that Iran has had with the Republic of Azerbaijan versus Iran's somewhat cozy relations with Armenia, given the tensions there. So I think your analysis is spot on as always. When it comes to Iran's possible rapprochement with Saudi Arabia, do you foresee kind of a lessening or a reduction of sectarianism as a whole in the Arabian Peninsula, or are we in this sectarian moment right now that is likely to continue for the coming years at least?
Great question, and thank you for the kind comments as well. It's a very difficult one, isn't it? You have to engage in a little bit of futurology here, but I think a lot of these things are. I mean, this is why I like the sort of sectarian entrepreneurship angle that is cited, because it's taking advantage of currents and things that are happening. So what we saw with the really terrible state of Iran-Saudi relations, in the last few years, although they're getting better now, I think was partly as a result of external factors as well. And I think especially Saudi Arabia being given carte blanche by the United States to pursue whichever regional policies it likes. So Iran had to sort of respond to that, and I think that there was an increase, but predating Trump as well, of course, obviously from the Arab uprisings, as I mentioned. But I think this is why I briefly touched on it in my talk, and I'm not sure how true this is, but if there is a downturn in Saudi-US ties, then that's something that Iran would like, of course, or at least rhetorically would support that kind of position. But the tricky position Iran finds itself in, of course, is that its whole sort of ontological security is based around this opposition to the US. So what happens when it's not a threat anymore? But I would assume that if there's a rapprochement then between Saudi Arabia and Iran, then you would probably see less of that kind of demonization and less overt sectarianizing tendencies, probably, within the relationship. Yeah.
I'll tell you, being based here in the Arabian Peninsula, I can't wait for the day when the sectarian tensions are over and we're beyond them. We have a number of questions that have come to us through social media. I'll do my best to get through them, and I asked the panelists if they could keep their answers brief so that hopefully we can get to as many of these questions as we can get through. I suspect the first question is for Fanar, but anyone, please go ahead. It's from Neil Patrick, who asks, what's the current extent of the presence of IRGC in Syria? Or perhaps Shahram can take this one, whether troops or in the form of advisors. And does any IRGC troop presence in Syria include physical control or a partnership role in Syria's border control or security with Iraq, specifically at Al-Bukamal? Anyone?
Well, I mean, since you called me out, I feel obliged to say something. I mean, the short answer is I don't know. I would presume that there is an IRGC presence in both Syria. Well, we know there's a presence in Iraq and in Syria. I would also presume that a lot of that presence is manifested through partnerships with locals. So we see this, for example, with borders. On the Iraqi side, something that I've looked at, something that Harith Hassan and Khadr have written quite a lot about. And what emerges is a sort of a complex web where the IRGC or their proxies or their friends or their clients or whatever you want to call them are not operating on their own. They're not operating in a vacuum, that it is a wider web of complicity and collusion that marks these arrangements in border areas.
Thank you. Thank you. Another question has to deal with the possibility of Donald Trump returning to office in 2024, or at the very least, the fact that the Republicans might make significant headways in the midterm elections, congressional elections in the United States. What does this say in terms of Iran's relations with the UAE, Saudi Arabia over the next couple of years? Edward?
Thank you. I'll jump in quickly, but yeah, it's a difficult question, again, because it's contingent, on US electoral politics. But obviously, Iran is hugely has a huge issue with that, given their experiences under Trump and the abrogation of the nuclear deal by the US. So, yeah, I mean, I can understand that the person who posed the question, that their concern about what a Republican victory or indeed a Trump victory might mean for that. And I think you're seeing some kind of hedging happening on the part of Saudi Arabia when it comes to this, playing a longer game in kind of hoping or banking on a Republican return, so it can have a freer reign once again. Obviously Saudi US ties aren't in the best state at the moment. So the UAE is a different issue. Iran has always had this quite it's been a very useful relationship to try and sustain, even when there have been obvious sore points in the relationship. I think that there is probably a more pragmatic drive in the UAE leadership to keep channels open with Iran, and Iran needs that as well, particularly if actually there's going to be any new raft of sanctions, because the UAE was of course very useful in circumventing them historically. So I think it would want to keep that relationship going if it could.
Thank you.
Can I jump in very quickly just here on the point of UAE and Iran and Trump's return? I think that as Edward has mentioned, UAE-Iran relations have been a love-hate relationship. Iran does need UAE to circumnavigate sanctions, go around sanctions, and UAE has been complacent in that sense. But UAE has also been very, very critical, quite vocal of Iranian expansionism in the region. So that's a big, big issue in the relationship. And on Trump's return, this really goes back to what Iran has been saying to the United States in relation to the nuclear deal. What will you guarantee that if you sign the deal today, the next administration won't tear it up, just like Trump did before? So this is a major concern in their major stumbling block in the nuclear negotiation in Vienna.
Thank you. We have a question from Paul Arts, professor at the University of Amsterdam, who says, doesn't the presentation today, the discussion, really boil down to the distinction that Fanar presented on sectarianism by design as compared to sectarianism by default? Could Shahram and Edward comment on this quickly, if possible, please?
First, hello, Paul. Good to see you or have you on the panel. It's been a few years since we actually talked. Yes, I think it does boil down to that distinction. That's a very important distinction. Of course, for Iranian detractors in the region, for Saudi Arabia, for UAE, and many others, Iran is pursuing a sectarian agenda by design. And that's exactly what I think most of us on the panel, all of us on the panel, have been challenging, that Iran may be acting as if it has a sectarian agenda. But the reality is that Iran has limited resources and sectarianism just happens to work for Iranian foreign policy. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. Edward?
Yeah, I mean, I'd fully echo that. And I think it's a very, very useful way of interpreting and understanding it. You know, I mean, it has greater efficacy, I think, as Fanar said, you know, and I think Iran will take advantage of that, given its, you know, comparative weakness and what it's up against. So yeah, it's about choosing the strategy that is most helpful for defending the regime. Yeah.
Thank you. There's another question that is directed at Fanar. Do you think Iran is currently losing hearts and souls of the Iraqi Shia and not reaching minds and hearts of many Shia Muslims around the world? It comes from our friend Carlos Mendez at the University of Edinburgh.
Well, thanks for the question. I'll try to be brief. I'll speak about Iraq more than the world. In Iraq, absolutely yes, I do think that is happening. Again, they have their constituency, they have their audience, they have their people, but that I think is a relatively limited base. I think that Iran has a soft power problem in Iraq. A former colleague and friend pointed out, he said, if you ask for all its influence in Iraq, if you ask the average Iraqi Shia guy about Iran, all they'll talk about is militias and religious scholars. How many Iraqis are familiar with Farsi or with Persian poetry or anything of the sort, right? So they have a soft power issue. I think Iraq, at a political level, there is growing, as I said, growing discontent. Let's even put Iran aside for a second. There's growing discontent and growing rejection of the political system in Iraq. And Iran is viewed as the chief guarantor and beneficiary of this system. So anti-systemic anger is de facto anti-Iranian anger as well, because Iran is seen, as I said, as the guarantor and the beneficiary of the system. Look at also Iran's chosen proxies, representatives, the political and security actors that represent Iran in Iraq. Again, their popularity, whatever base they had, and I would argue that they did have a base at one point, has considerably diminished as a result of their dominance within the Iraqi political system, which itself is coming under increasing rejection all along. So absolutely, I'd say Iran is losing hearts and minds, to forgive the phrase, in Iraq.
Thanks. And from your discussion, Fanar, is it fair to gather that this goes beyond the loss of Qassem Suleimani? And this this loss of hearts and minds of the Iraqi Shia isn't just because Iran lost a capable manager of its Shia partners or proxy groups in Iraq. Is that correct? It's because of changed conditions in Iraq itself.
Yes, I'd say that's right. But the loss of Qassem Suleimani has an impact nonetheless, in that they lost this manager alongside Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis that makes controlling or managing the Shia elite politics all the more difficult, that makes their proxies all the more unruly, which in turn increases their unpopularity and increases anger at the political system. But generally, I think you're right. With or without Qassem Suleimani's assassination, I think there would have been this shift.
I'm mindful of the time, so one final question we'll take. It says, thanks to the three panelists for these excellent presentations. The question concerns the role of China, which pursues a pragmatic foreign policy far from confessional considerations in the Middle East, Central Asia, and South Asia. Could China play a role in the outcome of a regional security agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, given the strategic repositioning of the United States in the region and the need for Gulf monarchies to diversify their strategic partners by strengthening their relations with Beijing? Will the interaction of Iran and Saudi Arabia into China's new or involvement of Iran and Saudi Arabia in the Belt and Road Initiative, would it at least partially resolve the issue of sectarianism? Edward?
It'd be wonderful if it was a panacea for that. I mean, I think there is some potential there, though, definitely. I mean, in terms of the regional security architecture, I don't think China has that desire in the kind of conventional understanding of promoting regional security. Incidentally, it's something that Iran has consistently promoted. If we were talking about continuity and change around Iranian foreign policy, it's continually promoted a kind of inclusive regional security architecture. It's actually the Russians, I think, that have probably been most keen on trying to promote that, although obviously their attention is elsewhere at the moment. But I think, I mean, there are arguments for kind of integration into broader economic infrastructural things that can help rapprochement, I would say.
Thank you. Shahram, I thought maybe you wanted to say something on that.
Just very quickly, I think echoing Edward's comments, China really has no desire to be the policeman in the region. Absolutely, Russia might have some ambitions of that nature, but China does not really see itself as committing the level of resources required to be a regional policeman.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We could go on and discuss this topic, but unfortunately, our time has come to an end. My apologies to those whose questions we couldn't take, but my sincere thanks to our audiences and particularly to our three brilliant panelists. I'm most grateful to all three of you for such excellent presentations. Sincere thanks and a good day to all from here in Doha. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.